Hello and welcome to the Sales Code Leadership Podcast with Kevin Teeler and my guest this week, Keith Bird. Keith is a three-time CEO who's founded and sold 2 tech startups and held senior roles at global software and tech firms including Proofpoint, F5, Symantec, Checkpoint, SonicWALL, Extreme Networks and EDS, an HP company. Keith, welcome to the call.
Hi, Kevin. Great to see you. Thanks for having me on the show at last. We've known each other a long time, as you said. I've been waiting for the big call up and eventually I got it. So I feel like the 7th man on the bench finally getting on the pitch.
You must I was just frankly running out of other people to interview. And then you start to scrape the bottom of the barrel, right? You just...
Exactly. And I'm the bottom of that barrel.
Oh, man. Really, no, seriously, it's a real pleasure. We've known each other for 20 years and we've always stayed in touch. In the meantime, we've both been pretty busy. You've had a great career, and I know that things have taken you in a different direction. So I want to talk about that in a couple of minutes. But before we do, let's do a little bit of intro then from yourself. What is it you get paid to do today, Keith?
Yeah, so I've had a change in direction, which is something I've always wanted to do. In June last year, June 23, depending on when you're watching this broadcast, I left vendor world to go into private equity. So I joined the private equity world in July 23. I've worked for private equity backed businesses. I've worked in businesses that have been acquired by private equity firms. And I've worked in firms that are VC backed, and I've worked in public companies. So I've kind of gone through the whole gambit. I've had my own startups as well. I had 2 startups earlier in my career. And there was an opportunity to go onto the private equity side, and it just felt like it kind of culminated everything I've learned and done over the years, and thoroughly enjoying it. So to answer your question, my day job is as operating partner for a company called Banyan Software. We acquire 100% of the share capital of vertical market software businesses and then help them grow and help them become even more profitable and more successful. And I'm responsible for heading up our portfolio of companies and being responsible for the capital that we deploy here in UK and Europe. And I'm also the director on a number of different companies. And the most notable one is I'm chairman of a boutique search and selection recruitment firm called DASON Group, who help great companies find fantastic talent, primarily in the cyber security software, networking and storage and social space.
Well, that's super. It sounds like you're pretty busy then.
Yeah, it's funny, Kev, you and I were talking about this off camera before, that you never think you can work even harder. And I'm not sure if you end up working more hours or harder, but every role you do and every venture you get involved with always has different challenges and different opportunities. And so it would be boring if that wasn't for that. So yeah, thoroughly enjoying it. It's definitely all keeping me very, very busy.
One thing I've noticed about you is over the years is that you got a particular talent for finding good talent, don't you?
Yeah, thank you. I think probably, most people have 2 or 3 things they're probably really good at, and then they're probably competent around the edges on everything else that you have to do. And hopefully, that's been one of mine. I think very often, particularly one of the things I've learned in later years in my career is the tendency, I think, sometimes when hiring is to look at the CV and the background, and particularly in the tech sector, where people can do really, really well, but not necessarily be world-class or A+ talent. And of course, everybody's got a place on the team, so to speak. But I think I do have an ability to kind of get below the surface a little bit and understand people and understand what motivates them, what makes them tick, where they've been successful, where they haven't, and what most importantly, where they haven't been successful, why that was, and what they've learned from that. And so I think it's probably something that I've been able to do. And fortunately, I've worked, I've had my own businesses, but I've also worked in some fantastic organizations that have given me the opportunity to build truly world-class teams. I mean, that's a really overused word in our industry, but truly being able to develop world-class teams. So, when you do that, you learn every single time. So when you do it the next time around, you probably get even better at building a better team. And I feel like over the years, I've learned from the people I've hired, the people that have been peers, the people that I've worked for. I've had this opportunity to learn from all of these folks, but also have a lot of practice at hiring people. Because if you and I have both got friends that are outside our industry, thank goodness, who have small businesses, and they may get to employ 5 people in a 20, 30-year business career. You and I, people like us, have had a chance to hire hundreds, if not thousands of people. And that exposure, it's like anything else in life. You get better and better at it. And so it's something I've enjoyed doing and got a lot out of it.
Well, let's drill into that a bit later in the call, because it's a really super interesting topic. But before we get to that point, Keith, I'm really interested to know a little bit more about you rather than about the people you've hired. This role that you've currently got, which sounds super exciting, well, dual roles actually, a multitude of roles. I think there's plenty to keep you busy there for a while. Is it what you had in mind when you were 16? Did you think you were going to be a tech sales leader when you were 16 years old?
That's a great question, Kev. Absolutely not. I actually had two vocations that I thought I was heading towards. One was to be a professional footballer, like all young, well, not all, but like a lot of young people who like football and play football and imagine themselves playing at Wembley. Clearly, that didn't work out. And the other was
were you any good at football?
I wasn't bad. Yeah, I played a decent level, like everybody in the pub always says. I played a good level of football. Yeah. I was fortunate to play at non-league level, at a decent level, and go into football coaching and management, and in fact only stopped managing football clubs about a year ago. And I've been involved in football, not semi-pro football clubs, either as a coach, manager, or on the boards. And have actually had investment interest in semi-pro clubs. So that's something that I thought I was going to do, because I had a little bit of ability, which is a dangerous thing. And clearly there were thousands of people at a better level than me. So that didn't work out. And then I really fancied the idea of being a policeman, but pretty quickly realised that for the type of lifestyle I wanted and the type of money I wanted to earn, you weren't going to get that in the police force. And their job is much more important than what we do, Kev, but pretty quickly figured that out. So got into the world of sales, because that seemed to be the world where you could make money and have a fantastic lifestyle and a career. And one thing led to another, and very quickly founded a business with a partner from school at 18, and then started another one at 22, and eventually sold that at 30. So yeah, I felt like everybody's story. I fell into tech and I fell into sales.
That is most people's story. Yeah. Actually, it's interesting you say that. It's very rare that you find, I guess selling isn't one of those professions that people like. Being a doctor, I think, well, I always wanted to do it. So it often is an accidental kind of career that people have, but you've been tremendously successful at it, haven't you? Well, what do you think is the secret of your success?
And obviously, there's a lot more successful people than me out there, but have done okay, as you say. I think the team thing that we were talking about has always been a common thread. It's part of my DNA. I think being a sports person, it kind of just got introduced. I mean, I've been playing. I started playing football at 7. At a pretty competitive level early on. That discipline and that feeling of team and competitiveness, kind of, you take that throughout your life, I think. And I think the team piece and the people piece is so important, because if you're going to be successful, whether you're an individual contributor as a salesperson, or a sales manager, sales leader, business leader, you can only do so much yourself. And that's a big lesson I learned in early years, because when you've got your own business, as you know, Kev, very often you're either the only salesperson or you're the top performing salesperson, because you're training a team behind you. But you can only go so far with that. And I pretty quickly worked out, not only were most of the people that were around me in sales actually better than me, But I also worked out that it was a great force multiplier. And if I could be successful in leading and managing people and managing businesses, it's a great force multiplier. You haven't got to do it all on your own shoulders type thing.
That is one of the things I like about you. You're very modest and self-effacing, which actually is quite a rare trait amongst the tech sales leaders that I've worked for and with. Probably that'll be something that we don't know that many people. You're actually genuinely humble. People talk a lot about being humble and being a servant leader, but you actually are, Keith, and I think that's remarkable. That you're very self-deprecating, which is a nice quality.
Oh, bless you. Thank you, Kev. I appreciate that. And straight back at you, there's we were talking off camera about people you stay in touch with, and there's a reason why you stay in touch with people. And we work in this amazing industry, don't we, where we just get surrounded by like-minded people. And I think the biggest thing is, the people in this industry, that the one common DNA thread for most people is, desire to be successful, good work ethic, having to work in teams, so there's a lot of great people out there, aren't there? And you take the good and you take the bad. And one thing that I've said to people I've mentored over the years is the great thing about advice is you can take the bits of advice you agree with, and the bits of advice you don't agree with, you don't have to take it, and the person that's giving advice will never know whether you took it or not. And I've sort of I've also taken that into learning about what's a great way and not such a great way to lead and manage people, and hopefully it's worked. I think one of the things that's a sign of of that a little bit is having people that are prepared to work for you multiple times. And if that is a very good point. Yes, if you've got that, you're probably doing some things right. But
that's a good point. When I used to go for job interviews, I would say to people, I wanted to point out in my career that I've worked for the same boss. I've worked for 3 bosses twice, so 6 different companies. So I consistently get rehired by people who rate my abilities. I think that's a good trait, actually, if you can find that. But so before we drill into hiring great sales leaders and how you do it, which is your specialist topic right now, I think we ought to talk about what makes a great sales leader.
Yeah,
so
great.
Perhaps you can tell me, what do you think are the characteristics, attributes, what do that makes a great sales? What do you look for when you're hiring sales leaders? What are you looking for yourself?
Yeah, great question, Kev. I think there's probably several things that are as important as each other. So in no particular order, I would say. Yeah, I think there's a few things in no particular order, as I said, and really they're all just as important. You've got to be competent. You don't have to be the best salesperson in the world. You don't even have to have had the best individual contributor track record. And we've been talking about football and sport already, and there's many examples of that, of great football managers that weren't necessarily great individual players when they're in their playing days. I think but you do have to have competency. So you have to be able to really be engaged. And there's a saying I have, which is particularly in the bigger vendors for sales leaders, and that is, and country managers and VPs, that I've had the fortune of having in my teams, is, are you reporting the news or are you affecting the news? And what I mean,
I love that. Just repeat that for us, can you?
Are you reporting the news or affecting the news? And what I mean by that is, a big part of the job, particularly in the bigger part of the vendor world, particularly in public companies, but everywhere now, is the dreaded word forecasting. And so many people are involved heavily out of necessity on the internal management and managing the spreadsheets, so to speak, which is great. It's an important part of the job, but it can't be the only part of the job, because what you're not actually doing is affecting the outcome of what's going to be in those spreadsheets. In other words, are you engaged with customers? Most importantly, are you engaged with your teams and coaching your teams and being hands-on? So by way of example, the company I was at, prior to going into private equity, the CRO was probably one of the most engaged executives I've ever worked with in terms of being in front of customers. And that set the tone for everybody. And I personally, in the 12 months preceding, or my last 12 months with that company, I personally met with 120 CISOs, presenting to them data and analysis.
So Chief Information Security Officer.
Thank you. Exactly right. So the most senior executive responsible for cyber security, if you like, before it goes to the CIO. I met with 120 of those one-on-one individually, and going through together with the account teams, not just me, together with the account teams, but talking about their business, what we were doing for them, how we were protecting them, and also giving them value back, because they've spent a lot of money with us, trying to help them get more value out of our solutions. So before you ask them to actually spend more money with you, how about helping them extract more value out of the investment they've already made in your solutions? And then we can talk about other areas that potentially they might want to invest in our solution. That's one example. Another example, when a deal goes off track, I can think of a fantastic salesperson that was reporting into one of my country sales leaders in a particular company I was at. Incredible individual contributor, salesperson. But if a deal went off track, they didn't have the ability to get it back on track. They just didn't, because they were great at running deals that ran really effectively and as they should. And if it went off track, they kind of couldn't figure out how to get it back on track. Using your own network. We've all got big networks. Is there somebody?
Do we though? Some people don't, do they? Some people don't. They don't.
No, I mean, no. When I'm doing deal reviews, and I'm not unique at this, and my last company were very good at that. Proofpoint were very good at that. We're doing deal reviews, and everybody's got their LinkedIn up on the screen, and as the account team or the account manager are talking about the person or people they're working at in the customer, we've all got our links up, and we're looking to see if we're connected to that customer some way as a first degree, second degree, or even third degree connection. Is there somebody else, if I don't know, is there somebody that can introduce me into them? So that's what I mean by the competency side. And then, of course, you've got areas which you're an amazing expert on, and you provide the services and training to your clients, but around whatever sales methodology you choose to use. And I think you and I both land on Medic, which I know you're very strong on. But there's obviously others out there. There's Holborn, there's value-based selling. So you have to be competent. And I've deliberately spent a lot of time on that first topic, because you can be an amazing, charismatic, motivational leader, and that will get you so far. But then once you're working your way through the quarter and the year, the team, what they need is you to help them win business or help them solve problems as to why their pipeline isn't where it needs to be. So that you have to be competent. And that's why.
Would you go for dull and competent, or charismatic and chaotic?
Amazing question. And I think it largely depends on the company and size of the company, because, no disrespect, we've both worked with and for some incredibly charismatic people who didn't do detail, right? And would never be on a deal with you, or in some cases even get in front of a customer. But they have. In some
cases, you wouldn't want them in front of a customer, would you?
There's that
at any price.
There's that as well.
Right. Some of the people you and I have worked for years ago, I suspect, were so scary. You kept them a million miles away from any customer you wanted to retain. Let's be honest.
You're far more candid and direct than I am, Kev. But totally, exactly. That was the point I was making. So,
well, you can do that when you're not looking for a job anymore, and I'm not looking for a job anymore. So
that's right. But they're amazing on stage and great in interviews and great on TV and all that stuff. But I think it does depend on the size and scale. I think in the modern world you have to be both, and that neatly leads me on to the other thing.
Well, do you? Okay, so I'm super interested in this, because I'm not going to talk politics, but let's talk politics for a second, because these are people in the public eye that we can talk about. Keir Starmer comes under enormous criticism for being very dull, but strikes me as being extremely competent. Whereas Boris Johnson struck me as being very charismatic, but entirely incompetent. So do you actually need both? Doesn't it depend on the role? I mean,
I think you have to have both. And I know people whatever your political view is, you mentioned Boris Johnson. A lot of people said Boris Johnson was the right prime minister for a certain point in time, but he wasn't the right prime minister when we went into COVID. Needed a different type of prime minister. I don't actually buy that. I think you have to have both. And I think that other one of charisma, being able to motivate people, being able to lead people. Again, I think the football thing and the sport thing helped me greatly in my formative years, because I was usually the captain or vice captain in many of the teams I played in, not just in football, but in other sports as well. And I think that natural ability of, knowing when somebody does need a kick up the backside, which, to be honest with you, most people, as much as they say, I'm not sensitive and you don't have to worry about putting an arm around me, in my experience at least, the majority of people do need an arm put around them. And the majority of people, in my experience, whether it's in football or in business, don't actually respond well to being beaten up and said, you've got to do better. They respond better when you do the classic sandwich. The start of the sandwich is, look, you're an amazing person. You're here. We hired you here for a reason, right? The middle of the sandwich is the bit that's not going well. This isn't going well right now. These are the reasons why.
You're talking about the shit sandwich here, I think.
Let's be candid. Yeah. Again, you're being fucking candid. And then the other end of the sandwich at the end of it is, but we're going to work on it together and help you get through this, right? People respond better to that than being beaten up every day of the week.
That's also known as the valley of despair, I think. You start people at the top, guys, and you take them down in all did, and then you lift them up, which is a good tactic. I think the people I've hired, I always try and hire people that kick their own backside. So I agree with you. Actually, those are the people you want, because you can't be around all the time to kick their backside. So I always wanted people who would kick their own backside. And in fact, therefore, they probably needed the pressure taking off sometimes rather than applying it.
I think that is an excellent point, Kev. I mean, I personally try to live my life through being my biggest critic and being accountable. And being authentic. But I can tell you, earlier in my career, including my sporting career, I didn't take criticism on board well. I look back now, we probably all do this. I look back now and I can vividly remember a conversation with a mutual boss that we had at a previous company. And I look back on that conversation now and I would handle it totally different today. I remember, and I was, whatever it was, 20 years younger, maybe slightly more than that. But I remember being in defence mode and being more focused.
But you were only 19 at the time, so
that's
right. Come on, you were barely out of school. Let us not be too hard on ourselves.
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah.
Even though I had 3 kids as well. So there you go.
Yeah, well, you started early, which is the sign of a true achiever. Get all that done. Then you can retire when you're 40 and enjoy yourself, which I'm sure that's
when you invited me on this show, I thought, how on earth are we going to get through this? Because you've been actually very measured up to this point. But I remember that conversation vividly, being more focused on defending my position and explaining why, as opposed to actually listening to what was being said. Yeah. And actually what was being said was incredibly supportive. And I think you get less defensive as you get a bit more experience, and you go into better listening mode as you get a bit more experience.
That's a sign of coachability, right? Isn't it? Because you've been coached, I think, in a sense, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Where people are giving you that sort of feedback, and it's so valuable. And I would say, from my own point of view, since we're being very candid, because we've known each other a long time, I was never terribly open to coaching until much later in my career, and it was a definite failing. So if I had to reflect on anything, I would say, yes, I think I didn't get much coaching, but I think that's because I wasn't really open to it. I think that's one of the reasons. I think the other reason is that there is a lot more enlightened leadership in tech now.
Yeah.
It's a slightly different environment for the one that you and I spent a lot of our careers in, the early parts of our careers, perhaps. And so I think your style of more consensual coaching type leadership is much more. Maybe you got ahead of your time, Keith. Honestly, I'm not even being glib about that. I think perhaps you were. I do also think there's quite a lot in the sporting comparison as well, because sales to me is a competitive sport. The reason I love it is because I was terrible at all other sports, and I still am. But I was a asthmatic youth, short-sighted, and not athletic, right? So I was hopeless at school sports, and I went to a very sporty school, so it wasn't good. But I find selling is a competitive sport for me. So do you find that when you hire salespeople and sales leaders, that's quite a common theme?
Yeah, I think so, but not exclusively. I mean, I remember at the early part of my career, it's awful to think about it, but I remember one leader saying they don't play any sport. Why would we even interview them? I remember reviewing a CV, and most of the CVs you had with people coming into sales had something in there about sport, whether it was rugby, football, cricket, tennis, swimming, whatever it might be. And I actually remember this one leader saying, "Oh, red flag for me." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, they've done no sport. There's no sport on their CV. And I thought, wow, that's so close-minded, right? Because as you just demonstrated, I mean, the reason you and I are still in touch is because I have the utmost respect for you. And you said I was ahead of my time. I think you're ahead of your time, Kev. I can think of many examples. I think you're ahead of your time. Incredibly charismatic, smart, taught me a lot of things. And and you've just said, sport wasn't your thing. So think of all the companies that would have missed out on your abilities by taking that approach. I think we mustn't over pivot on the sport thing and the competitiveness. I think for me personally, it's something that helped formed me, but we all get that from somewhere, whether it's sport, family, friends, something we've watched. So this could be schooling, education. We'll find our path and we'll pull from whatever helps us find that path. And for me, it just happened to be the competitiveness of sport, but it doesn't have to exclusively. We've got to be careful, I think, we don't over pivot on that.
Well, let's do that then. Here's a question you're not prepared for.
Okay.
Who's the best sales leader you ever hired? So I'll let you have three. You can pick three if you want.
I'm not going to name them,
okay.
Just in case they wouldn't want me to name them. But I once hired somebody, and I hired them back after previously firing them, or not directly firing them, but they were in my chain of command and they got fired. And they came back into my world probably about 12 to 15 years after that first event. And
what was good about that person? Tell me what was the secret sauce?
I talked at the beginning that I think there's two things in equal measure: competency and the character, if you like. This person had bundles of competency. This was the person that went into a company and went through an incredible sales academy program and was top of class and incredibly smart, but perhaps was failing a bit on the emotional IQ and wasn't everybody's cup of tea, if you understand what I mean by that. And when I met them 12 to 15 years later, they had really worked on that. And they were popular with people they worked with, people that worked for them. So now, what a powerful combination. They'd already had the competency. They had that in abundance at the beginning, and they'd really worked on themselves and realized and it was authentic. It wasn't that they were trying to pretend to be somebody. They'd realized they were going to have to work on their relationships. Forget leadership, but build relationships. And that person was an incredibly successful leader in the business. So that's probably the best hire I ever made, and it was a rehire in effect. But I've hired loads of fantastic people. That's probably a great example of thinking outside the box a little bit, maybe.
What do you look for in a recruitment company then when you're working? Put yourself back in one of these big tech vendors where you've been like the senior VP sales and stuff, commanding legions of sales managers and leaders. What do you look for in a recruitment company to help you to get those people in? What does a good recruitment company do?
Yeah, it's a great question, and not to take too much advantage of the question, Kev, but it's the reason that we set DASON Group up, and I'm the chairman of DASON Group, this boutique search and selection firm I mentioned, because candidly, there's some really great ones out there, of course, but candidly, in my experience, the competition wasn't amazing in most cases. And I think it stemmed from the fact that, and again, no disrespect, because headhunting is a profession, and there's, again, a competency. But it's really difficult to do it if you haven't been on the vendor side or the supply on our side, if you like, the client side. It's really difficult if you've only ever worked in recruitment and not on the client side, because you've never walked in the client's shoes. You've never hired and got it wrong and had to live with the pain of firing people because you hired incorrectly. You've never hired people that have gone on and made quota and made plan and been hugely successful. You just haven't done it. It's not Christmas, you just haven't done it. And so you haven't been exposed to that. It's like the reason, I'm a UEFA B license. I took all my FA football coaching badges, and I eventually took my UEFA license, which means, in theory, I can go and coach in a professional club. But there's a reason I'm not the coach or manager of Chelsea or Tottenham, because I've never been on the field and experienced football at that level. And so that, for me, has always been an issue. And the ones that have done it well, whilst they haven't been on the client side, they've at least taken the time to understand the brief and, do that classic, which we do at DASON, or the team at DASON that run DASON do, which is you use the first 2 or 3 with the client to get a barometer of, have I got the brief right? I've understood the brief. These may not be the right 2 or 3 people for you to interview, but have I understood the brief correctly? And when headhunters and recruiters have done that to me when I'm the client, I've really appreciated that, because I think, okay, they're ready to make sure they've got it right. I think the other thing is, if you're in that world, you must have a network, because anyway, the barrier to entry in recruitment, starting a recruitment company, is very low. You need an email and you need LinkedIn and a phone. That's it, right? In theory. But having access to LinkedIn and just scrolling through, profiles and filtering on LinkedIn will get you so far. If you don't know that person, and sometimes you do have to hire people you don't know, the level of risk goes up. Whereas if it's somebody you know and you've worked with them, or somebody's worked with them, you've brought that level of risk down. So it's where they've had a decent network of people that they know, and it's not just they found them on LinkedIn and pretend to know them, they really know them. They're probably the 2 things that I think have set good recruiters apart that I've worked with.
And how much notice do you take of a CV?
I definitely look at it. Definitely look at it. It's important. We know that, let's call it little white lies, that many people will put on their CVs, and I'll be honest with you, I've never got hung up on trying to trip someone up on their CV and saying, well, you said you worked at this company on these dates, but on LinkedIn, it's these dates, or there's a gap. I've never really been bothered about that stuff. I mean, I know, people are supposed to not tell little white lies in a CV, but, life is life. I'm more interested in using the CV to frame the discussion. And, I try, and in that hour or 30 minutes or 45 minutes, whatever it is, I try and use that time really effectively for me and the candidate, and not just ask them to tell me what's already on their CV. And I spend probably, if I do go through the CV with them, I probably spend 5 or 10 minutes. Because could you, for me and our audience, our listener, 3 great questions to ask interview candidates? If you're the hiring manager of a tech company, most of our listeners are people doing jobs like the one you used to do, where you were running a big sales team at a tech vendor. What are the 3 best questions I should ask to an interview candidate when I'm screening them for a top sales leader role? Well, one of them I actually touched on earlier on. I say to them, don't tell me about a deal you won and what you did well. Tell me about a deal that went off track, and how did you get it back on track? And, the ones that have really impressed me are the ones that took quite a lot of time answering that question, because getting it back on track isn't as simple as, I phoned my, and I'm just trying to make this succinct. I phoned my champion up and asked my champion to put some influence on the decision maker, and okay, nothing else. Well, no, that got us back on track. Okay, fine. And so, I asked them, give me an example of one where it took you off track. And the most impressive example was a lady who told me that she took the time to go off and speak to 12 different people in that organization that she'd never worked in before, and how she created this swarm around, the decision-making unit inside the customer. But what she did that was smart was she said to the decision maker, look, we're off track here. I won't go into the details, but we're off track. I know this person in your organization. I've worked with them previously as a client in a different company. Do you mind if I talk to them? And the client said, no, absolutely. And got the decision maker's permission to talk to that person. So first one I say is, give me an example of a deal that's gone off track and what you've done about it. If it's a leader, the second question I would do is, tell me the last 5 people you met with and over what period of time. And that will immediately give me an indication as to how engaged they are. Because if they have to really struggle to think of 5 customers, then they're running their business through a spreadsheet. Secondly, if those 5 customers went from January to December, then they're not heavily engaged. If they reel those names off real quick and they've met all 5 of them in the last month, that tells me that's a leader that's really, doesn't have to, if they said in a quarter, it'd still be fine. But if they tell me that, they met with those customers in the last month, that's a little green tick for me. And then probably the third one is, when you think you've closed the deal, and this is back to an individual contributor, when you think you've closed the deal, tell me what you do between then and getting the order. And, people that have been around a long time, we know that you haven't got the order until you physically got the order, right? And we know there's a lot of happy ears. And your experienced members of this podcast, which there'll be most of them, I'm sure, will know all the things about who's got to sign off, how many people got to sign off, are any of them on holiday, blah, blah, blah. But don't assume every individual contributor, particularly ones early in their career, know that stuff. And they may talk to it because they've heard it. They've heard it in the sales training, and they've heard their more experienced colleagues talk about it. And so when they hopefully do touch on it, I dig in. I said, well, that's interesting. How did you do that? How did you keep? Who did you go to find out what the different number? How many people had to sign off on this order? How did you ask 5 really important people? Are they going to be on vacation between now and the end of the quarter? And of course, the answer is they did. You don't. Whoever your champion is, you ask them to go off and find that stuff. But so you can quickly find out whether they really did it or they're just saying it because they know they're supposed to say it. So they're probably 3 good examples. I will just say one other thing, if I may, on this topic, and that is when if the best companies at hiring have always impressed me, and it's surprising how few do this, where they lay out what you want each interviewer to interview on. In other words, if you're going to have a 5-stage interview process, and I have no idea why people do more than 5 stages, certainly for an IC role, but if you're going to have 5 interviewers in a 5-stage interview process, you know where I'm going with this, Kev. What a waste of time to have 5, in effect, first-round interviews. Because if every interviewer is asking the same question, all just going through the CV, the candidate's experience is rubbish because they've asked, they've just taken you through the CV. And most people know how to do the first 1-hour interview. Most people have got a little story, a little pitch. They're quite well oiled on their first hour of their first interview. But if you can make every interview about a competency, then you're going to get a lot more out of it, and you're probably going to make a better decision. So I know you didn't ask about process, but I feel really that's a really important part of it, is whether it's 3, 5, 7, however many it is, all agree who's going to interview for what.
Well, that was a really good recipe for hiring great salespeople and great sales leaders. And I guess great sales leaders, you get great sales leaders, they'll hire great salespeople, won't they? Should work like that.
Yeah.
Should work like that.
It should work like that. I mean, I think we're fortunate in this industry in particular that, we tend to rehire, as we were touching on, we tend to hire people that we know have been successful. But I'll give you an example where you run out of steam on that. And that is my last company, which is a fantastic Cyber Security Saas business. I remember first coming in and thinking, right, I know all the great people that we need to bring in to turn the sales around. And within it took me 3 or 6 months, but I worked out all the people that you would normally go to were not the right people, because actually this wasn't a job where you had a book of 20 or 25 key accounts all spending. You had a book of 2 or 3 key accounts spending if you were lucky, and the rest was really named prospects. They weren't really accounts, they were named prospects. So actually what you needed was new business type people, but new business type people that would know how to work accounts once they'd got them. And that was a very different profile from the people that I had in mind when I first went into the business. And so, you know, hiring great sales leaders, hiring great salespeople works most of the time. But if you go into a different world, you may have to readjust your thinking about who you would normally go to.
Great advice, Keith. Great advice. Well, you clearly are an expert at asking penetrating questions, Mr. Bird, which means you're also very good at answering the questions that I've asked you pretty thoroughly. I've only got time for one last question. And the last question is, what's the one thing you wish you knew at the beginning of your sales career?
Oh, wow. That is a great question. I think it would be decide if you're an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur. And if I'm candid, when I sold my second business, excuse me, at 30, I didn't actually realize that my next 10 years, which was my first 10 years working in corporate, I hadn't realized how much I was going to wrestle with that, because I always felt like ultimately I needed to go back and run my own business. And if I had rethought it or turned around my thinking, I could still be an entrepreneur, but within the safety or support of a bigger organization. So I think it would be, are you an entrepreneur? And if you are, don't waste the next 30 years of your career working in companies and being unhappy. You might earn less money, you might earn more money, but if you're an entrepreneur and you want to run your own business, go and do it. Don't waste the time. When you and I started out, Kevin, the internet didn't exist. In fact, the internet didn't even come out until about 3 years into my second company, right? And I doubt
I don't know why I'm laughing, because I'm a hell of a lot older than you.
I doubt there's many.
No internet is a shocking thought for the younger listeners to the podcast.
And I'm not even talking about dial-up making all those silly noises. I'm talking the internet, full stop. And there will be most people, I'm sure, watching who can relate to that, but there might be some who that was after their time or before their time. There's no better time now to start a business. You know, you've got the internet. There are business models that didn't exist when you and I started out, and access to money. My first business, me and my business partner, I can't believe our parents did it, but our parents very kindly put their houses up as collateral for me and my partner out of school to get a business loan, right? Now, I love my kids to death, but I wouldn't do that. But now there's much more access to funding and much more advice on how to fund a business. So if you're an entrepreneur, go and do that. Don't waste. If you're going to go and get a job, do it for 5-6 years, learn how to really run a sales process or manage a sales process or build a product. You know, that's what it's great for. And then go and do your thing. And it might take you 2 or 3 times to get there, but do your thing. And if you really want to work in a company, you're still an entrepreneur, but you're an intrapreneur. And think about being an entrepreneur. So if you're a regional sales rep or account manager, the patch you've got is your business. You've been given a franchise to run the financial services vertical, or you've been given a patch to run Northern Europe, or whatever it might be. That's your business. You've now got your own business, and guess what? You're funded. You get a salary. You got a marketing team. You got a brand. You know, depending on the size of the company, it's still your own. You know, just think about it as being your own business. It will help your mental health. It will affect your work ethic, because you'll find your work harder when you think about those things, and you'll be receptive to learning and coaching and self-development. So, yeah, I would say that's probably what I would say is, are you an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur? And both are great.
Keith, it's been a real pleasure having you as a guest on the Sales Code Leadership Podcast. Thank you for your time.
And you, Kevin. Thanks for having me on. Great to see you again. Cheers.